Wednesday, June 21st, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm Bob Harris. You've made your way to the Football Diehards YouTube channel, and it's time for a regular Wednesday on the Hot Seat program. I'll begin cranking up the fire momentarily. But first, FootballDiehards.com is the website. We appreciate you joining us here on the YouTube channel every Wednesday at this time and every Saturday at noon Eastern Time for our Ask Me Anything live streams, or Ask Us, as how the case has been recently with great guests. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell if you haven't already. If you previously completed those YouTube tasks, you know the next step. Hit the like button. Feel free to dislike me as well. I will dislike us already just to make sure somebody feels okay about that. Appreciate the honest feedback, people. Hit those buttons. Come at me at the comments if you have anything to say, any feedback. Just in general. Do you like the show? Do you not like the show? Do you want to see other things? Do you have ideas that you'd like to see? Just throw that in the chat. Also, throw your questions, comments, and those suggestions, any applicable general smartassery up in the chat as well. We'll work our way through all of them. And by we, I mean me. As I said, I'm Bob Harris. That was like the aggressive one. Everyone likes I like the aggressive one. I'm Bob Harris. It sounds like I know what I'm talking about when I do that. I certainly know my name. Also, I know my guest's name. It's the great Eric Romoff today. You know him on Twitter at FantasyNav. You know his work at Football Diehards. You see him here on the DFS live streams with Jamie Calandro during the season. You also know him from the Pros with Joes, the Green Screens Media. They do crazy things over there. And a little work with Dr. Roto as well. So, Eric, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. We're chipping away, right? Well inside of 100 days until the start of the NFL season. We're about to be counting it down in just a few weeks. So, really starting to get more information coming out of OTAs. And then come July 1st, it is the heart of draft season, right?
Yeah, we're going to work on some of that as well. Hello, everyone in the chat. I see you out there. JSC, Royal Slade, Golf Boy, Charles Davis, Robert, Brian. Appreciate everyone coming. Alan, nice to see you. Nice to see everybody. Ryan, tons of people out there. Hopefully all of you regulars will be ready to jump in with questions. If you're new here and you haven't been here much, love the questions. Going to have some conversations about some of the ongoing issues involving the NFL. There are things going on right now, Eric, and we like to kind of dig into these things a little bit. If you hear something that interests you out there in the chat, go ahead and throw a spin off it. Just got the pro forecast in the mail today, said Robert Seeley. Yes, the pro forecast is done. You can get those. You can get the digital version right now on the website, FootballDiehards.com. Use the promo code Diehards for a 15% discount. The Football Diehards, which will have a fantastic article. I have it on good authority, by Mr. Eric Romoff on DFS, as you would guess. Jamie Calandro handling the DFS business in the pro forecast. Some good information there. As you guys know, we always try to keep it kind of evergreen, but use current examples so you kind of get the best of both worlds. We understand magazines go out of date. That's why you get free access to the website. It's great that way. It works out really well. The magazine snapshot in time, set your baseline, and then dive in. Most of you have been here all off season long. Your baseline is set, and you're just plugging more information into the continuum. So we'll get into that. So the big news. Well, I don't even know if it's news yet, but it's something to watch. The Tyreek Hill situation in Miami. He is being investigated. Apparently, there was an incident at a marina. Maybe somebody got hit. The issue there, and the Dolphins have commented on it and basically said the usual boilerplate thing. We know something has happened. We'll reserve further comment at this time, I believe was their actual comment. He has a long history of issues, though, along these lines of violence. And this is the problem, Eric, is the NFL takes into account that long history. Like, they can go back to your college days. I know somewhere Joe Mixon said, what? But no, they can't. So we have to watch out on this. Let's just, look, we don't know what the outcome of this is, if anything, right? We've seen him in hot water before, and he's miraculously escaped. So maybe this time. Let me ask you, though, something about the Miami offense in general. So I think we're all drafting, the top receivers there. Tyreek Hill, whether you get him in round one, which is like 99% of the time I'm seeing that. I can't imagine him making it to the second too often. Jalen Waddle going in the second or maybe the early third if you get kind of lucky. How do you feel about them hitting your ceiling? We think Tua Tagovailoa has done some things this offseason to at least learn how to roll better, right? He took the jiu-jitsu or the judo classes, I think, to learn how to fall a little better. Also trying out a new helmet. He's trying to do things to keep up. How confident are we that Mike White can keep that ball rolling if something does happen?
I mean, if we're at a point where we're depending on Mike White for any sustained period of time, we're very likely at a point where we're no longer accounting for the ceilings in terms of fantasy production for Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, right? Like he can still run an offense and operate somewhat successfully in there, but you're not going to find those weeks where, either of them is the top scoring wide receiver. You're not going to find him supporting both of them particularly well in any given week, right? So all of this is to say, we better hope that his jiu-jitsu, that him wearing the camera on his helmet over the course of OTAs will ultimately help him avoid another head injury, because really the peak, the upside of this offense and the skill positions that it supports, it all hinges on Tua's availability for me.
It really does, and we're only going too deep on this receiving core. I don't think anyone's looking at the tight ends here, the wide receiver 3 at this point. Not even, flyers and best ball. There are other guys I would rather take my chances are. By the way, I see you out there, Mr. Scampers, a.k.a. Sampers, as I called him in the Front Yard Fantasy chat today. I don't know why. I blame me. He, for one, enjoys the show, and so I'm glad somebody out there likes it. Eric, what's your favorite football team? JSC is asking this. Just trying to keep up with the chat. Do you have a favorite?
I am one of the 4 or 5 lowly Houston Texans fans out there.
Oh, you poor bastard. It's horrible. I want to get into so maybe this is a good point to do this. I just kind of want to get into this. I've been thinking a little bit about how we're handling not great offenses. And by the way, I have no favorite teams. I hate them all equally. I kind of like the easiest one is my favorite one. When you're covering football, it's like asking a dishwasher what their favorite dish is. The cleanest one. So kind of works like that for me, but I get it. So Houston, let's say, extend this conversation to Arizona as well, right? And by the way, hi, Andrea. Hi, Albert. Nice to see you all. So glad you could make it today. Really appreciate your time. I know you have a lot of choices out there, so we appreciate you coming here and hanging with us for a little while. Houston, Arizona, I'm trying to think if I think that's kind of the bottom of the totem pole. Throw any other teams in there if you like. Are you guys out in the chat want to go ahead? I feel like these are value opportunities to mine some value, right? I joke about it here almost every week. The Nico Collins waiting for me. Bob, I'm here, way late in drafts. When I'm getting wide receiver 1s well into those double-digit rounds, I'm not really worried that it's not a great offense. It's still the wide receiver 1. How do you feel about this?
Yeah, right. Like the or weakness of an offensive unit has always kind of dragged down the fantasy stock of the players that play in that offense, right? So you talk about teams like the Texans, teams like the Cardinals, right? If you want to lump, the Broncos in there, they were a very low-scoring offense last season. These are teams that just on the surface, fantasy players aren't really all that excited about drafting players on those offenses. And so inherently, they almost always become a value, right? You gave the Nico Collins example. I mean, he at least has the inside track to be the starting outside receiver for the Texans, and he's readily available in rounds 10, 11, 12, right? So that's a glaring example unto itself. But even more incremental gains in terms of value are available with guys like Damien Pierce, with guys like one of our favorites, James Conner, right? Like the average fantasy player isn't making it a point to get into these offenses. These aren't offenses that you want exposure to necessarily. And while that creates value, it also doesn't mean that they should be avoided outright, right? These are still going to be NFL offenses, and they're going to contribute points, maybe not to the same level as some of the other teams out there, but still have a role to play on your fantasy rosters.
And still, I'm avoiding many of the Cardinals. I just recently started getting some shares of Marquise Brown. I'm starting to feel like, it's going to be. I feel like it's going to be Colt McCoy's quarterback, but there's been a little buzz about Clayton Tune, the Arizona Republic, Bob McManaman, kind of threw that out there, a speculative piece. People don't think it's a news report; it's a speculative piece, but he makes a pretty good argument for it, right? I mean, you have. I think Colt McCoy is serviceable, right? And if he's the quarterback, there may be some pieces there that we're overlooking. But I don't think it goes any deeper than Marquise Brown for me. Are you taking any chances beyond that, unless you're in Dynasty, throwing your shares out there at Michael Wilson, who claims he's the steal of the draft now that DeAndre Hopkins is gone?
Yeah, there are plenty of recently drafted that field that are in fact the steal of the draft, right? So, Marquise Brown is certainly the one that I have the most exposure, right? The weird thing is, from that incoming rookie, this wide receiver core for the Cardinals is tiny. Marquise Brown is the tallest among them at 5'9", right? So fortunately, this is his second season in the offense. We saw him really shine brightly when DeAndre Hopkins was serving a suspension last year. So, whether it's Colt McCoy for a little bit or for a while, I do think he'll be the focal point of this Cardinals offense overall. But, size does matter in NFL context when you're talking about wide receivers, right? So, Michael Wilson towers over everybody in this wide receiver room, and he might have a pretty clear path to playing time, right? He's obviously got, the draft capital that they expended to acquire him this year, and he is the one thing in their wide receiver room that is not like the others. So, he'll have his bumps and bruises along the way, as most rookies do, but ultimately, if he's going to get playing time, I think he's, worth at least a very late round kind of speculative ad.
Yeah, and I think you and I mentioned both, both of us in on James Conner seems to be the only real piece there. They have worked on the offensive line, a team that needs to score touchdowns. Why not the guy with 2 seasons of double-digit touchdowns to his name? I think that's a reasonable assessment. I think he's going at a great price. Damien Pierce is a guy I'm not getting a lot of. Am I overthinking the presence of Devin Singletary as being an issue for him? I know I've seen some people argue this pretty forcefully, that they think Singletary is going to play a more prominent role than maybe some of us expect.
I'm not in that camp, right? I think if there's an argument to be made against Damien Pierce, it's more to do with his current draft capital. He's coming off the board right around the end of the 5th round. I feel much better with him kind of in that 6-7 range, but that's a fair value overall for a guy that cracked over 1,000 all-purpose yards in 13 games as a rookie, a guy that the Texans drafted themselves and are able to really run into the ground on a pretty reasonable rookie contract, right? So for me, I think the opportunity lines up a bit more for Pierce than it does for Singletary. I think Singletary is the clear change of pace option in this Texans offense. But, if those rumors keep swirling and we see that push down Pierce's draft stock even further, then I will be well exposed to him as the summer goes on.
Yeah, I don't think you want to go crazy on any of the pieces. Some of the other names, I know Robert Woods, people are interested in John Mechie. I would love to see him, have a happy ending to his story, or at least a happy progression. Best of luck to him. But, aside from the already sunk dynasty costs in there, I don't think people should be out chasing that. Ryan wants to know in the chat, Eric, if the Carolina is going to regret not grabbing one CJ Stroud, making the Bryce Young choice. And I feel like, to me, Bryce Young, the size is the question, right? And I know there have been some comparisons to Russell Wilson, who has had a great career last year notwithstanding. And maybe this year he can get back on track, the slimmed down version of him, trying to do his Drew Brees impression as he heads into his first season with Sean Payton. But, and that's kind of the difference, right? Like the comparisons to Russell Wilson, he's a little thicker than Bryce Young. Bryce Young is not a big body person. Which one do you think has the upside there? The processing ability for Young it seems to be the selling point. What is the selling point for Stroud, and why might he be better?
Yeah, I think the selling point for Stroud is probably a bit more to do with his size, of course, just the durability and his ability to the field, projects out more cleanly than kind of an undersized Young. But also, he's incredibly accurate throughout his college tenure. And I think he can do more with his feet than we might have seen, in terms of what he did as a Buckeye, right? Generally speaking, they're running a very pass-heavy kind of NFL-style offense there at Ohio State. But there were a couple of games where there was inclement weather, and we saw C.J. Stroud do a little bit on the ground, right? So maybe we see that incorporated a bit more in his game than we did while he was at the college level. And for me, those are really two primary differences between these two, right? If you're able to project a longer career, obviously that's something that you want out of your very early first-round draft pick quarterback. And if he can move a bit more and just give the offense more options in terms of how he can advance the ball, that plays very well in today's NFL offense and schemes. In terms of Bryce Young, I mean, you mentioned the two clear comps, right? Both Russell Wilson and to a lesser degree Drew Brees are, a little bit thicker than he is, but ultimately, and he said it, he's been playing at 5'10" his whole life. And there have been examples of guys that are below 6 feet still able to, have very successful NFL careers. So, it's a knock against him to an extent, but I don't think it's a death nail that he's not one of the, kind of prototypical 6'3", 6'5" kind of towering pocket passers. He can still get it done and has gotten it done at his size for the entirety of his college career at Alabama, which, they have some big boys on that O-line. So hopefully we'll see him carry that forward in Carolina.
If you watch any of the video from OTAs, apparently Carolina also has some really big boys. Or Bryce Young is is actually smaller than we think. A couple of questions in it. A little bit of both. Golf Boy wants to know in best ball, is Logan Thomas or Cole Turner the late round Komando tight end flyer to own? Okay, so I'm going to take this one because I have some shares of both, right? And Cole Turner has been a recent one, and I will explain why. It came from talking with Matt Waldman, who thinks, the skill set fits. We were talking, I was contending that this Kansas City style offense, who knew? The tight end is kind of important. And so obviously a much better receiving core in Washington. So I don't think it's a, head-to-head comparison. But you would think that Eric Bieniemy would have some notions of what he can do with a tight end. So I'd been investing some late-round flyers in Logan Thomas, but Waldman kind of threw out the Cole Turner thing. He was hurt all last year, has a super excellent skill set, mobile, good pass catcher, all those things. So I asked David Harrison from the Locked On Commanders podcast this, and he too kind of is keen on Cole Turner. Look, it's a total dart toss, people. You should make your dart tosses. You should not make mine. So Logan Thomas, I think, should be the default answer because I do think he's at the top of the depth chart right now. But Cole Turner is like if you're trying to look like the smartest guy in the room after the season, you want to say, "Oh, look, I had a share of that, dude." That's why you're taking him. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, look, the real answer to this question goes back to how it started, right? This is a question about best ball, and Logan Thomas, while he may be, atop the depth chart for now, he's kind of a known quantity in terms of, what you can really expect for him in terms of upside in this Commanders offense. Whereas Cole Turner, he's the shiny new thing, right? He's shrouded in mystery. He has some potential that is yet to be tapped into at the NFL level. And specifically where you're drafting these two players, you're not trying to get a Logan Thomas who can contribute 4.5 to 6.5 points a game, right? Like you really want to shoot for upside in the back end of these best ball drafts. And, it's certainly riskier, right? But, burning a 14th round pick on a guy that, could potentially really emerge in this offense and score a meaningful amount of points in your lineup. If he does, that's the trade-off that you have to make for best ball.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that is kind of thinking it's something I think I'm trying to do a little bit more of. I want to say be a little more forceful, be a little more of a risk taker, right? And I mean, look, we're all trying to do that a little bit, but I think I'm trying to be way more assertive about it. And to that end, Royal Slate, by the way, tight end related. We'll get to your question here in a second, Alan. He's taking Gesiki late a bunch. I talked to Nicole Yang, covers the Patriots on a daily basis, and she confirmed what others are reporting, that he was a monster during OTAs in the minicamp, right? He just lit things up. He and Mac Jones have a good connection. I think all the reporters there have kind of said the same thing too, both tight ends, Hunter Henry as well. They were both, and maybe this is just a dearth of talent on the outside, right? So Juju Smith-Schuster has not been working much. Tyquan Thornton was injured. By the way, I asked Nicole, or my late round dart tosses at Tyquan Thornton going to waste. And it seems like he was a little more of a thing earlier this offseason. Recently, he's been dealing with a soft tissue injury, and that seems to be slowing his progress. So if you're sitting here expecting him to be locked in ahead of Devontae Parker, you're probably kidding yourself at the moment. Like, it could still happen, but it has not happened. And I think we're all drafting Tyquan Thornton like it has happened. But Gesicki seems like a guy that if you got him in the right spot, look, we've seen him be productive as a receiver. I'm pretty sure that's all the Patriots are going to ask him to do because they realize he's not there to block.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly it, right? And it's not surprising that he's won minicamp, right? We've seen him win off seasons in the past. He is an athletic freak of nature, and while there's always some animosity around the idea of rostering a Patriots tight end because they typically deploy two, very clearly if they're deploying these guys based on their skill set, I think it should be Mike Gesicki that is the move option in that offense. And now that Bill O'Brien is in New England, now that the dead ends in the offense from last offseason have been removed as Matt Patricia has been relieved of his duties, I do think that we see this offense take a bit of a step forward. And going back to his head coaching days with my beloved Texans, Bill O'Brien is not shy about using the tight end in his offense, right? So I think we're going to see a lot of 12 personnel, and in the personnel, I think Gesicki is going to be the default pass-catching option while Henry does a bit more blocking.
And welcome in if you're just tuning in. I see the numbers growing. So I'm Bob Harris. He's Eric Romoff. This is the Football Diehards YouTube channel on the hot seat. Eric's on the hot seat, but so am I. We're both feeling the heat because we're both in Texas, and it is broiling here. So good for us. A lot of questions in the chat, which we will work our way through over the course of time. If you have anything, throw it in there, people. Hit the like button. If you haven't already hit the like button, hit the dislike button. If I'm irritating the living crap out of you, go ahead. I don't care. No, I do care, but I want honest feedback. So here we go. Alan wants to know extreme. It's like the temperature here. And I had a storm here today. Like, my cat is still missing. I'm very nervous. Don't worry, Mr. Scampers. I think you'll be okay. But damn, man, hell of a storm. So extreme Samaje Perine exposure in the best ball. Maybe 70% in 60-ish drafts. All or at or below ADP. I think that's the only place you get Samaje Perine right now. I mean, people are not all in on this. But should he dial back on that a little bit now that he's got that 70%, 60 drafts? I think it depends on how many drafts he's doing, or should he keep at it? What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, just in general, you can color me in the hesitant camp in terms of Samaje Perine's role and therefore value as a target. But overall, any player that you're going to have 70% exposure to is probably a little bit overextended, right? So obviously, those drafts are in the bank. You can't go back and adjust those rosters. So good news for you. It just means you get to go out and draft more, right? If you like Samaje Perine, you end up at a place where he is your highest rostered player. More power to you, right? I think that there's a reasonable path to him contributing in a meaningful way. But ultimately, 70% exposure is a ton, right? So just go out, draft 2, 3, 4 more dozen teams, maybe kind of water him down to that 40 to 50%, and I think your portfolio will be better overall for it.
Right. So, I mean, assuming everything goes ideally for Denver, right? And I don't know that it will, but Javonte Williams, maybe he's getting better, maybe he's not. We don't have enough information on that. They'd like us to think he is, so that we've got that for us. But I do think that there hits a point where I start to feel oversaturated in best ball, right? And so how often do you ever do this? I mean, I've started doing it more and more, just going and looking at your shares, because sometimes you feel like, oh, I'm getting a ton of this guy, then I go and actually look and I go, I don't have as much as I thought. I can get a lot more. And by the way, don't worry, everyone, Mr. Wally the cat, I think he will be fine. He's probably just holed up somewhere. He is very resilient. Wally, very resilient. So I think I find myself checking my shares because I do get a perception in my head, especially like, your own little recency bias going. You draft a guy 3 or 4 times and you think like he's on every damn roster, and you go and you look and you go, I'm at 7%. This is going to be just fine, right? So how often should you be checking? And at what point do you feel, is there a percentage you feel like I'm oversaturated, I need to dial back?
Not a hard and fast percentage, right? I would think of it more as a portfolio, like I mentioned, right? If there's one player that you have 2, 3, 4 times more exposure to than anyone else that you've rostered, probably an indication to try to spread that out a bit more, right? For me, I'm checking my exposures pretty much every single time I finish a best ball draft, and very often while I am in that draft, right? Because I find myself getting in these ruts where it just feels like I'm always drafting this guy in the 7th round or in the 4th round, right? And so I want to make sure that I'm managing my exposure to that player in particular in terms of my overall portfolio, my overall best ball portfolio, but also I want to be cognizant of these habits and these patterns that I've got into and kind of challenge my way of thinking, right? If I'm always going after the same guy in the 7th round, what other kind of loops or biases or pitfalls am I falling into with my decision-making process, right? So when I see a guy all the way up at the top of my exposures, makes me wonder, who are the guys around that player that I'm potentially passing up, and why do I keep making this decision? Do I need to revisit that decision-making process? So it's much more of an analytical process than it is, I want to stay under 40% or 30% on any given player.
Alan acknowledging that he is oversaturated, but seeing what's Sean Payton's system, no Williams maybe for a few weeks, maybe longer, right? We just don't know. Makes him look his chops. Portfolio logic helps. Yeah. It does. I'll just as I look at mine as we were sitting here having this conversation, I just went and checked. I'll check on best ball 10s because it's easy for me to do right here. Hello, Brandon Cooks at 45%. Hello, James Conner at 41%. A lot of Geno Smith, a lot of Michael Thomas, a lot of the cheaper guys that I tend to grab in the same range. I have an awful lot of Derrick Henry. I've said it before on this very live stream and on Saturdays. If he goes off that cliff, Bob Harris, going with him. And I'm Bob Harris. He's Derrick Henry. He's much better than me. Eric Romoff, also very good at this. So let's get some more questions. This one I like. Could I argue, says JSC, that Cooper Kupp should be the first wide receiver taken in drafts? He averaged the most points this season up until the injury. Well, let me just say, I do rank Cooper Kupp as my wide receiver 1. Not a popular opinion. Turns out Justin Jefferson is quite popular. Ja'Marr Chase probably more popular. But I think your point, JSC, is well taken. That average point per game in this Los Angeles offense has been monstrous for Cooper Kupp. It was last year. He did lead the all NFL wide receivers in fantasy points per game. Just didn't play enough games. I'm thinking the quarterback situation will be better. All things, at least to start the season. I mean, we went all last offseason with Matthew Stafford nursing an elbow issue and obviously, was not great going into the season. This year he's throwing. I'm a little more enthusiastic. I think they have to have fixed the offensive lineup a little bit. Don't see them adding great components in the passing attack. And by the way, someone is also asking, I want to see who that is, about Sony Michel in that offense. Brian Larkin wants to know. His role will be hoping to hold a roster spot, I believe, at this point. I wouldn't get my hopes up. If you're investing in Cam Akers, continue on that path. Cooper Kupp, you've heard my argument, Eric. And I mean, I think we all know, that this is kind of like there's 3 guys that are very close together and you can pick your poison. What's your poison, sir?
So it sounds like I'm a little bit closer to you than maybe the field. I actually go Ja'Marr Chase first, then Cooper Kupp, and then Justin Jefferson. But back to our best ball conversation, really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to rotate these 3 to a pretty even exposure across all of my drafting, right? Because they are very clearly in a tier onto itself, right? So, with them, you can split hairs and try to figure out, who's going to edge up to that 1 spot or who's going to fall down to the 3 spot. All 3 of them are fantastic options. The thing that has me more bullish on Cooper Kupp relative to the market is all of the statistics that you mentioned about last year, right? This is a player that, only played about half the games, but when he was out there, number 1 in fantasy points per game, 22.4 fantasy points per game. And this was behind and navigating through really kind of the worst case scenario for this Rams offense, right? You had Matt Stafford playing through a variety of injuries. The further removed we get from that, the more that we can expect that to at least improve, if not resolve outright. And they were playing behind, I was going to say a wet paper bag, but an offensive line that would be jealous of a wet paper bag in terms of their ability to stop pass rushers, right? So you're talking about the worst case scenario for this offense, and it's still one where he led the entire league in points per game, right? So even if the offense is bad yet again, you've kind of seen where that floor is, and that floor is among the elite at the position.
Right, and I think if you look at Justin Jefferson, he disappeared some games, right? And so I think this team's going to be very pass heavy, and he'll be fine, right? Like I'm not worried about taking Justin Jefferson. It doesn't concern me. I'm trying to spread out with my number one picks overall, and I've taken some Jefferson. I've taken some McCaffrey. I'll take just about anyone. I think I'm throwing Bijan. You guys heard my, early on when I started jumping into best ball room, I had like 6 guys. And those 6 are still there. I mean, the running backs, Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler, I think are in that top 6. Travis Kelce's in that top 6. And then the wide receivers are in that top 6. And it starts with Kupp, Jefferson, Chase. And I'm probably throwing Bijan in the mix now. He'll probably be up there in that range as well. I don't know how you feel about that, Eric, but I feel like that's a reasonable. I'm just trying not to invest all my number one picks overall in the same guy. Because Jonathan Taylor told me last year that was not the best way to do it. So I'm trying to learn from some of these things. Again, you don't want to get caught up in what happened to you last year, but you might want to pay attention to it. So what is your number of guys? What is the number? So I think, when I say that, like there's 6 or 7 guys, and I'm obviously pretty comfortable picking through that 7th pick if I had to. What's your number?
So for me, it's really 3. It's actually the 3 wide receivers that we just talked about. I am more than happy to take all 3 of them as the first overall pick. And then there's a pretty clear tier break where there's about 4 more guys that I'm mostly comfortable with, right? The aforementioned Jonathan Taylor is in there. Christian McCaffrey, this is the point where I'm looking at a guy like Travis Kelce as well. And then it sounds like we are in lockstep, at least for redraft purposes, very bullish on Derrick Henry, right? So while he's in that kind of second tier, kind of my 7-pack of players that I'm confident in, I'm able to get him much later than that in terms of where he's falling in ADP. So I'm finding myself with a lot of Derrick Henry builds because I'm happy to take him in the early second round because he represents a fantastic value relative to where I have him ranked.
Or even the late second round, as I did a best ball yesterday with my good friend Lisa Ann. She's doing her 30 best balls in 30 days. I jumped in one yesterday. I had the number one pick overall. Started out with Christian McCaffrey. Came back around thinking, what receiver will I take? I'll take that one named Derrick Henry, who's much bigger and gets the little passes called handoffs. So I started my first 2, that first pick, and then came back around on the turn and started out with Derrick Henry. Wasn't great receivers, or wasn't the super high end receivers left, but I was fine with that. I'm big on Amari Cooper, so there we go with that. So a few comments in here on what we're talking about. Dame Overboard, snagging Cooper Kupp in nearly every best ball. He keeps falling. I agree with that totally. Mr. Scampers, Cooper Kupp, good. So good. I mean, it's, when he's not in sight for a little while last year, you forget just how good he is. He is phenomenally good. JSC prefers Chase over Jefferson literally only because of Joe Burrow. And that's a fair argument, right? The quarterback situation, I'm guessing that's part of how you see it, right, Eric? Is why you have him ahead of Jefferson is maybe the quarterback situation is part of that equation.
That is absolutely a big part of the reason why I have him ahead of Justin Jefferson, right? Not only my confidence in Joe Burrow as a distributor of the ball, but also his willingness to push the ball down the field in key moments, right? We've seen Kirk Cousins kind of shrivel up in those moments, but also, I mean, don't look now. There's a lot of continuity in this Bengals offense, right? Zach Taylor, has been there and has maintained his staff and therefore maintained his offense since he came into Cincinnati, right? So I think there's a lot more familiarity and a lot more stability with this offense. And these are 2 ships passing in the night in terms of trajectories in their NFL quarterbacking career, right? Burrow is arguably still on the ascent. I think Kirk Cousins, we've probably seen his peak, and he's either plateauing or maybe going to start declining in the years to come.
Yeah, question in the chat, Eric. How do you feel about one Calvin Ridley at his current ADP? Seems like you're looking at around a 4th round price tag. I'm bringing it up for the current pricing on Best Ball 10s just to get a little better feel where he stands in the wide receiver room here. It is a wide receiver 18. How do you feel about that price?
I feel not good about that. And a lot of that is I very much so want to fall in love with the situation that Calvin Ridley finds himself in and what he means to the Jaguars offense overall. But that price tag is steep, right? I mean, I don't want to besmirch anyone's good name, but I'm getting a little bit of tingling like the sensation that was following Allen Robinson going to the Rams a few years ago, right? Like a player that has been fantastic in years past. They're moving to a new situation where, they should have all of the support around them that they need. They have a great quarterback there, able to, really elevate them to the next level. All of the on-paper stuff really looks to be there. But until you actually see it come to pass, drafting him as a borderline wide receiver 1, or at least, a definitive wide receiver 2, you're taking a lot of risk there, right? So my hope is that over the course of the remainder of the offseason, over the course of rosters ebbing and flowing and guys getting hurt or guys emerging, there are a few more darlings that emerge at the wide receiver position, and we see Calvin Ridley kind of slip back to that wide receiver 22, 24-ish range. That I'm comfortable with. But, I mean, that price tag is steep for someone that we haven't seen play in a couple years and is a brand new system.
Yeah, the range of outcomes I think is wide for him, and I do think a super huge season is entirely possible. But Brian, certainly. In his second question, I think you've already answered it. Which Jaguar wide receiver would you prefer? I said Jaguar. Mike Dempsey cussed at me somewhere out there. Which Jaguar wide receiver would you draft? Calvin Ridley in the 5th round or Christian Kirk in the 7th? And I think we all like cheap things here in this room. I would prefer. I'm not getting a lot of Kirk, but I would prefer that over Ridley.
Yeah, I think both of those are actually a little rich, but I mean, whenever you have a 1-1A type of situation at wide receiver, I'm almost always going to opt for the cheaper of the two.
So says Eric Romoff and me, Bob Harris. You can follow me on Twitter at FootballDieHard. Follow Eric at FantasyNav. Find his work at Football Diehards, Green Screens Media. This is a fantastic thing. Get Green Screens and check out the App Pros with Joe's handle too. I'm guessing something will be going on there later this summer, so looking forward to that. We were talking about Cincinnati for a minute, and I wanted to circle back around to that because of the Joe Mixon news that came out. I believe it was Paul Denner Jr. in The Athletic mentioned that maybe Joe Mixon's willingness to take a pay cut is the thing that's going to determine his future with the club. So I felt like we got to the point where we were pretty confident Joe Mixon was still going to be around because nothing had happened. Seems like that might not be the case. So we'll throw Mixon out of the equation. Let's pretend there is Joe Mixon. What do we do with that backfield?
Let's pretend there is no Joe Mixon?
Yeah, let's pretend Joe Mixon evaporates. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, sorry, Joe. Now that you're street, I mean, it becomes a pretty murky situation overall, right? Like, I mean, Chris Evans is still there from last year, so you have someone who's familiar with the offense at least, right? Chase Brown is the rookie option. I think the reality is if we don't have the presence of Joe Mixon, who's really kind of the only all-purpose runner in that running back room, I think we're looking at, a certainly a split backfield, very likely a 3-headed committee overall. Probably Chase Brown getting a bit more of the third down and pass catching work, and Chris Evans getting the early touches. But I mean, the reality is, if that comes to pass and they don't add another aging veteran in off of the street, then we're looking at a pretty murky situation at the beginning of the season.
I think that would be the most likely outcome, would be the addition of a veteran or making some kind of move. And I think Dalvin Cook, I mean, if you're not wanting to pay Joe Mixon, I don't think you want to pay Dalvin Cook either. Ezekiel Elliott might come cheap. Dak Prescott, he's been working out at Dak Prescott's house, Ezekiel Elliott, and there's still some hope, I guess, from Dak's standpoint, that there will be some. I see all the people in the chat howling for Chase Brown. I hear the Chris Evans talk, and I'm wondering why everyone's in with this Travion Williams slander. I'm not going to stand for it. Not going to take it. A lot of talk about Travion Williams from the coaching staff this offseason. He's been around a little while. I don't know that I have any. Like, I wouldn't be out there drafting that guy. I would probably be drafting Chase Brown as well. But there are pieces there. But I think the piece that might be the the biggest issue for a Chase Brown or whatever is probably not there if they move on from Joe Mixon. Remember, Joe Mixon's off-field issues have not been resolved either completely, right? Had Drew Davenport this very live stream a week or so ago, and he mentioned that those charges are still pending, or at least the investigation is still pending. Joe Mixon, one of those guys with some history dating back to his college days, and so that's something to watch as well. So we'll see what goes on there. Have a question here: Saquon Barkley or Josh Jacobs as your RB1? I don't think either of them are the RB1. So Saquon Barkley, some good news. I want to say Ian Rappaport saying that talks have resumed. They kind of shut them off. But beyond just the talks on the long-term deal, they have until July 17th to get it done. If not, you have to play on the tag. And he will play on the tag, which, he hinted he would not. I find that hard to believe. And I would say the same for Josh Jacobs, who has suggested that he's in this to help all the future running backs. I would take a look at your own future, Josh Jacobs. And just, look, nobody thinks it's great that people aren't getting paid commensurate with what they think their value is. But, we don't all get to determine our own value. The league is determining this value, and they're just devalued running backs. So of those two, which one would you prefer?
I would err on the side of Saquon Barkley, right? For this Giants offense, obviously they went out and added Darren Waller, but I think we're looking at another year where he is going to be the focal point of what the Giants are trying to do when the offense is on the field. Yes, there is some uncertainty as to how this contract situation gets resolved, but Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, like you mentioned, the idea of walking away from the tag is not really viable, right? Like, they just have to adjust to the fact that this is what the running back market is today. And, that's underscored by what happened in free agency, right? Like, you've got a guy like Miles Sanders who had 1,300 all-purpose yards. He got the biggest contract for a running back in the free agency market, and essentially it equates to 2 years of the franchise tag, right? So, like, you're only as loyal as your options, and if you want to hold out and make a principled stance, you can. But if he thinks that he's going to hold out and find a better contract for himself, I think he's probably lying to himself, right? So ultimately, cooler heads will prevail. I think, if he hasn't come to terms with this reality, that will settle in over the course of the offseason, and we will see him suit back up for the G-men. And when he's out there, he is the center of gravity in this offense and would be a pretty good amount of space ahead of Josh Jacobs for me. He's actually almost 2 tiers ahead of him in PPR scoring for me.
Yeah, I think I would say a tier ahead for me. I don't want to dismiss Josh Jacobs, but we have heard some good things about Zamir White. By the way, the contract deals, I think it's worth noting. When you're doing these long-term deals, there's kind of a formula in place, right? You're getting your tender offer, your $10.1 million. Next year, if they had to franchise you again, it would be another 20% on top of that. So they tack that on. Then the third year, everything you get beyond that is a little bit of gravy, but you would get $22 million guaranteed over the next 2 years. And I think Barkley's more likely to get that than Josh Jacobs at this point for the obvious reason. So I do have Barkley well ahead. The volume was phenomenal last year for Josh Jacobs, and I wonder if he can benefit from that. He was only back with more carries than my guy, Derrick Henry. And by the way, I just looked at another draft I totally forgot about that I'm in the middle of an underdog draft where I had the second pick overall. Also started out with that same exact build with 2. McCaffrey came back around at 11 in round 2, got Henry, went back around and got Amari Cooper. Have added some decent pieces to that, though, in the wide receiver room. I added DJ Moore, Tyler Lockett, TJ Hawkinson. So I got DJ Moore and Hawkinson on the next turn and just now picked Tyler Lockett, waiting to make my next pick. And so I'm not like totally unhappy with that build. I'll be honest with you. I'm feeling kind of good about it. I guess that's why I've done it twice in the last 2 days. Way to go, Bob Harris. That's me. I'm Bob Harris. We got a couple more minutes here with the great Eric Romoff. We're going to talk about a couple other things. By the way, the Giants, the receiving core, Jordan Ronan from ESPN reporting that Isaiah Hodges, my guy, Isaiah Hodges, getting lots of work with the first team, but also the reporting out there on Paris Campbell is off the chain, right? Like Paris Campbell is the best thing since sliced bread. We knew this in Indianapolis. He was the best thing since sliced bread. Everyone who covered this team on a daily basis said, Paris Campbell, best thing since sliced bread. Maybe even canned beer, which I don't drink, but I'm told it's very good. But he's had some really horrible injury luck. And not like an injury-prone luck, but like, you know, a car wreck, a bizarre compartment injury, or, you know, these weird injuries that have kept him from being on the field. And here he is now in Giants land, and they're like making all kinds of usage of him, running him out of the backfield. Maybe that's a function of no Saquon Barkley there at this point in time. But what do you think of this receiving core? They're all dirt cheap. You can have the one you want and not pay up. What do you do?
They're all dirt cheap for now. I do think that we will continue to see what if the Giants use Paris Campbell like Deebo Samuel rhetoric splash about over the course of the summer. And I do think that will find his ADP continuing to climb. But for where he sits today, I mean, he's the most expensive of the lot, at least in my most recent best balls that I was drafting, and still, you know, fairly affordable. The two guys that you mentioned are really the two names of note for me, right? Paris Campbell was the big offseason acquisition to the wide receiver room. Arguably, you know, all of these wide receivers are probably going to be the second or maybe even third option behind Saquon Barkley and Darren Waller, assuming that they can both make it onto and stay on the field. So, you know, these are value guys that, you know, you can get in the, you know, middle to later rounds, and, you know, will have a role to play in this offense. They'll see the field a fair amount, excuse me. And because of that, you know, as we're getting into that later round, you know, kind of criteria, I tend to swing for upside, and that is clearly Paris Campbell. You know, the risk is there as well, but, you know, all of his workout metrics are insane and off the charts, right? 99th percentile speed, 99th percentile 40 time, 97th percentile burst score. So if this is the point by which in his career that he is going to play a full complement of games and he's going to be featured in the offense, obviously that upside is dramatic, right? And that's the type of speculating that I want to do in the later rounds.
I'm with you. A couple of quick questions here. Any chance that Devin Achane can become the Dolphins running back one at any point this season? Yes, there is a chance. It diminishes greatly if Dalvin Cook arrives. And I don't think it's like an automatic. There are going to be weeks where he is the running back one there just because he's the guy that finds the end zone, but I think it's going to be chopped up. And they're all priced right. You know, I've been getting a lot of Jeff Wilson shares. I think he's the guy not named Devin Achane to get. He's a little cheaper than Achane, so that's the direction I'm going. But I feel like Dalvin Cook would like ruin whatever shares I have of any of these players at this point, so I'm not getting any more. But I want to get on to this question because there has been a little news out of Pittsburgh this week. So Ryan wants to know Nick Chubb or Najee Harris as a running back one for you. Royal Slade has already chimed in, as has Mr. Scampers, with, in my view, the correct answer. But go ahead, Eric. What do you think? And why isn't it?
The pressure's on. I hope I make the popular choice. I would tend to agree. It sounds like with the consensus that it is in fact Najee Harris. You know, we are looking at another year, unfortunately, for Steelers fans of Matt Canada at the reins of this offense, and that means that it is going to be predictable and boring and have dead ends in it. But it's also going to be very run heavy, and it's going to highly accentuate a player like Najee Harris. So, you know, Harris, the knock against him has been efficiency. You know, he had kind of stretches last year where he was a little bit more efficient than he was in his rookie campaign. But ultimately, if he's going to get the amount of volume that we've seen him get, he is going to be a premium option. And volume presumably was heading the way of Nick Chubb, but you know, I think that we're actually going to see more of a paradigm shift for the Browns offense and really look to feature Deshaun Watson in his first full season as a Brown. So Najee Harris would be it for me in a vacuum, but with the kind of ancillary forces that are pulling the offenses in different directions, he's a slam dunk relative to the two.
So you like Harris at the price better than you like Nick Chubb. That's what you're saying.
I do. Yeah, I mean, Chubb basically needs to become Derrick Henry to really be an elite option, and that type of volume I don't think is going to be available for him in Cleveland.
So here's my concern for Najee Harris, though. The reporting right now coming from The Athletic is that Jaylen Warren is demanding a bigger role, and that they're going to use him and they're going to have a hard time keeping him off the field. I don't know that is absolutely true. I still think I prefer Chubb, but I think, looking at the relative prices, you could make an argument for Harris. I'm not as keen on the offense. I'm gonna go with Chubb here as the pricier option. I usually go for the cheaper things. And I think you've swayed some people here. They wants to know, why do we tend to want wide receivers to get carries instead of targets? Wouldn't the target be better? It would be, but the carries do add something, right?
Yeah, they certainly do, right? And at least in recent years, this isn't a zero-sum game, right? We're talking about established wide receivers getting carries added into their mix of touches, right? If it's a vacuum of they're going to get 10 touches, would you rather them be catches or carries? Clearly it's carries, right? But usually you're seeing guys, woven into the offense in more unique ways and getting more touches by way of their work on the ground.
Yeah, to me the difference, and I mean it's splitting hairs here, but if I think I'm getting a handful of certain touches on the ground, I'm kind of excited about that, because not every receiver catches all his targets every game. Not every receiver is targeted every game. Sometimes they get to shut down in that regard. So if they get carries, I'm happy about it. But ideally, I get a target monster who's getting 150 plus targets, for his offense, and it's a productive offense. That's obviously, to me, the ideal. Like, the Devontae Adams, whatever you feel about him this year, in previous years, it hasn't really mattered. He didn't need to carry the football because he was getting every opportunity in the world. So I like that. I do think that's an interesting take on Harris. I'm not as sold on him, but I do. There are arguments going back, and we can take this all the way back to the Matthew Berry piece coming out of the Combine, where he talked about all the people there, and he's talking to all the behind the scenes folks and gossiping. And the expectation is we see something closer in Cleveland, something pass heavier, right? And I think that makes total sense, assuming Deshaun Watson takes a step forward and comes something closer to what he was in the past. But also, we've seen running backs fare really well playing with Deshaun Watson in the past too. So I don't know. I'm kind of torn on this one. And I'm going to be honest. If I went back to my shares, I don't have a lot of either of those guys. And I usually draft all the Harrises I can because got to support the family. But did not. All right, we got a couple more minutes here. If you got another question, get it in now, and we'll get to it. We've got to get Eric out of here in a timely manner, and so we will do that. Also, though, I had a couple of little things that I thought were interesting to hit on. That Dalvin Cook thinks his shoulder is fully healthy, following off-season surgery. I think that's great and everything. There's nowhere he lands a true feature role, right? There's nowhere he shows up that he gets that lead, that like the primary role that he had in Minnesota, or is there?
Not in the current landscape, right? I think the most likely scenario where he gets a feature role is somebody who has a feature role now gets cut, like we talked about with Joe Mixon, or maybe a feature back gets injured, and that team needs to go and fill that void. But I mean, ultimately, this is part of the reason why we're expecting Barkley and Jacobs to sign their franchise tags, right? Like, that market out there for running backs is rough, and Dalvin Cook is doing anything he can to try to reassure potential suitors that he's healthy, and I think doing anything he can to keep his name in the media, right? Just kind of stay top of mind by self-reporting that his shoulder is feeling good, right? So, the landing spots for where he is right now are, very likely to be some sort of timeshare, but, maybe something opens up and he'll probably be the first guy to get a call when that happens, right?
He is waiting, and for that exactly the
Yeah.
reasons you outlined. JSC, any chance Jerome Ford sneaks on the fantasy radar? Yes. Unfortunately, I'm not going to say how that happens because those 2 shares I have of Nick Chubb, I don't want to jinx. But yes, you see where I'm going. So Brian Larkin wants to wanted to ask us, and thank you, Andrea. Appreciate the kind comment. Do we see Detroit tight end Sam LaPorta as a red zone target? And I'll mix into that the report this week, the Detroit Free Press, that Amon-Ra St. Brown wants to get down the field more. Doesn't want to do the shorter stuff. So kind of plumb the depths of both of those. I do think, people are making this argument for Sam LaPorta. Maybe it's the lack of quality depth. All due respect to Brock Wright and Brandon Zylstra, or whichever Zylstra is there. But what do you think about LaPorta's chances? And do you want Amon-Ra's role to evolve?
So for LaPorta, I mean, he profiles as a nice red zone target, right? There aren't really a whole lot of guys that can say that in terms of the pass catchers there in Detroit. So, there's that working for him. But the reality is, like, the path for rookie tight ends to make a meaningful contribution in the NFL is usually a little bit longer, right? You're not seeing a ton of guys that come in and immediately contribute year one, right? Everyone is kind of thumbing their nose at Kyle Pitts after his 1,000-yard rookie campaign and not realizing how extraordinary that was for a rookie tight end to contribute in that way, right? So I think if anything else, I would say temper your LaPorta expectations, because the rule as opposed to the exception has been it takes a little while for tight ends to ramp up. In terms of Amon-Ra St. Brown, I mean, as someone who's heavily exposed to him in Dynasty and in best ball, I want him involved in the offense as many ways as possible. In terms of how he profiles, I mean, it's kind of a abnormal fit for him, right? He's much more of like a short area quickness, agility, burst kind of guy. And, that raw skill, that kind of straight line speed is a little bit more important for the down the field stretcher type of role. But on the other side, like, I mean, who else is it going to be, right? Like, it's not going to be Josh Reynolds or Khalif Raymond. It's not going to be Marvin Jones playing his like 150th season or whatever it might be on his like 5th or 6th stint in Detroit, right? So like, he's certainly the best option that the Lions have to fill that gap while Jameson Williams is out. So, I mean, I'd love the idea of him getting as many targets as possible. I don't know how effective he'll be if he's running downfield more often, though.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan. I don't need that change. I need Amon-Ra St. Brown doing the Amon-Ra St. Brownish things that I've enjoyed so much the last 2 years. And one last question here, and I'm going to take this one. JSC wants to know, would you rather draft Bijan Robinson in round 1, Jahmyr Gibbs in round 4? I'm going to tell you, Jahmyr Gibbs is growing up, right? If the argument is that running backs as rookies get their workload based on draft capital, may I remind you that Jahmyr Gibbs went 4 picks after Bijan Robinson, perhaps ensuring a pretty good workload, running behind a great offensive line and what looks to be, once again, a very explosive offense. And Tim Twentyman from the team's official website told me just a couple of days ago that Jahmyr Gibbs is the best receiving back he's seen in his 15 years covering that team. He covered DeAndre Swift the last couple of years, and DeAndre Swift was pretty good. He was like, running back 20-ish or above, even beat up. So, yeah, I'm probably still taking Bijan in some of those, but I'm mixing in a little more Gibbs as we get into this. Maybe I have enough Bijan, and Gibbs at the cheaper price is starting to appeal to me a little more for the reasons I said. Mr. Scamper's not here for the Marvin Jones slander. Nobody is. Great show. Appreciate that, Eric. Thank you so much for coming on, jumping in at the last minute. Love you all for coming and watching this. Go to FootballDiehards.com. Use the promo code DieHards. There's magazines. The 34th edition of the Pro Forecast available now. And the Diehards coming out soon with the work of the very great Eric Romoff in there. Follow him on Twitter at FantasyNat. Follow me at FootballDiehard. I'll see you here at noon on Saturday. Love you. Bye.